Professor Kethmori had spent the better part of 3 standard cycles preparing for this moment. The first human exchange student in the history of the Galactic University of Zephyria was finally arriving, and as the head of xenobiology, he would be conducting the initial physical assessment. His research on Deathworld species had earned him considerable acclaim, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for actual contact with a creature from Sol 3. The human designation was Emma Rodriguez, age 17 standard years, from a continent the species called North America. According to the preliminary data, she was considered average by human standards, neither particularly large nor particularly strong by her species metrics. This information had been somewhat reassuring to Professor Kethmori, whose own species, the Veltai, were built more for intellectual pursuits than physical endeavors. The examination room in the university's medical wing had been specially modified for the occasion. The standard furniture had been replaced with reinforced alternatives capable of supporting a human's dense bone structure and heavy musculature. Even the walls had been reinforced, though Kethmori privately thought that might be overkill for a simple physical assessment. When Emma entered the room, Professor Kethmori's first thought was how deceptively fragile she appeared. Standing roughly 1.6 meters tall, with dark hair pulled back in what his cultural database identified as a ponytail, she looked more like a young Veltai student than a creature from one of the galaxy's most notorious deathworlds. She wore simple clothing, what humans called jeans, and a t-shirt, and carried herself with the easy confidence of someone completely unaware of how dangerous her very existence was to everyone around her. "Hi, Professor," Emma said, her voice carrying the peculiar vibrations that human vocal cords produced. "Thank you for accommodating me. I know having a human student here is probably pretty weird for everyone." Professor Kethmori activated his translation device and managed what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. "Not at all, Miss Rodriguez. We are honored to have our first human scholar. Please, have a seat, and we'll begin with some basic physical assessments to ensure your safety and the safety of others during your stay." Emma settled into the reinforced chair with fluid grace, and Kethmori began his examination. Her vital signs were extraordinary: a heart that beat 70 times per minute, pumping fluid through a circulatory system that operated at pressures that would rupture a Veltai's delicate vessels. Her lung capacity was enormous, designed to extract oxygen from an atmosphere so rich it would be toxic to most species. Her bone density readings made his instruments recalibrate twice, unable to believe that such structural integrity could exist in a living creature. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, consulting his tablet, "I must ask about your planet's gravitational field. Our records indicate Sol 3 has a gravitational pull approximately 2.3 times stronger than our homeworld. How do you find our environment?" Emma shrugged, a gesture that caused several of her vertebrae to audibly shift, a sound that made Kethmori's skin crawl. "It's kind of nice, actually. Like everything weighs less. I keep overcompensating when I walk. Yesterday, I accidentally jumped onto the second floor of the dormitory, instead of just stepping up onto the curb." "Fascinating," Kethmori murmured, making notes. "And the atmospheric composition? Are you comfortable with our oxygen levels?" "A little thin," Emma admitted, "but it's like being at high altitude back home. My hometown is about 1,500 meters above sea level, so this feels similar. Though I did notice I don't get winded as easily here." Kethmori nodded, continuing his assessment. The next test involved grip strength, which he was particularly curious about. He handed Emma a device designed to measure applied pressure, originally calibrated for species across the known galaxy. "Simply squeeze as hard as you comfortably can," he instructed. Emma took the device in her right hand, which Kethmori noted was designed with a prehensile thumb, an evolutionary adaptation that spoke to her species tool using sophistication and gave it what appeared to be a casual squeeze. The device's display flickered, showed an error message, flickered again, and then simply went dark. "Oh no," Emma said, looking genuinely concerned. "Did I break it?" I tried to be gentle. Professor Keith Morey stared at the device, then at Emma, then back at the device. In 3 decades of research, he had never seen a grip strength tester simply cease functioning. The device was rated for pressures that could crush most known minerals. Perhaps the device was defective, he managed, though his voice carried uncertainty. Let's move on to the reflexes test. What happened next would be discussed in xenobiology circles for decades to come. Professor Keith Morey had intended to simply tap Emma's knee with a standard reflex hammer to observe her response time. It was a simple test, performed thousands of times on thousands of species. He approached her chair with the small instrument, which was designed with a soft synthetic head to prevent injury. "This may feel slightly odd," he explained, "but I'm just going to test your reflexes." Emma nodded and relaxed her leg. Professor Keith Morey raised the hammer and brought it down in a gentle tap just below her kneecap. What happened next occurred faster than his eyes could track. Emma's leg jerked upward with explosive force, a simple, involuntary reflex that her body performed without any conscious input. Her shin connected with Professor Keith Morey's extended arm just below the elbow joint. The sound was unmistakable, the sharp crack of breaking bone. Professor Keith Morey stumbled backward, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Pain signals flooding his nervous system. The reflex hammer flew across the room and embedded itself in the reinforced wall with a sound like a gunshot. Emma looked down at him with genuine concern, not even bothering to stand up from her chair. "Oh my God, Professor. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. "I'm so sorry, that was just a reflex. I didn't mean to do that." Through the haze of pain, Professor Keith Morey realized the true horror of what had just occurred. This human child had just shattered his arm with an involuntary muscle contraction. She hadn't even been trying to hurt him. She hadn't even been trying to move quickly. Her body had simply reacted the way human bodies were designed to react, and that casual biological response had just broken his bone like a dry twig. I'm fine," he gasped, though he very clearly wasn't. "Shh, just, please, don't move." Emma remained perfectly still in her chair, looking increasingly worried. "Should I call for help? I can carry you to the medical center if you want. I promise I'll be really, really careful." The image of this Deathworld creature carrying him anywhere made Professor Keith Morey's remaining bones ache in sympathy. "No," he said quickly. I'll call for assistance." As he fumbled for his emergency communicator with his uninjured hand, Professor Keith Morey reflected on the day's discoveries. The human hadn't attacked him. She hadn't been aggressive or hostile. She had simply existed in the same space as him, and her mere existence had nearly crippled him. "Professor?" Emma's voice was small and concerned. "Are humans really that much stronger than other species? Because everyone keeps acting like I'm dangerous, but I don't feel dangerous. I'm just me." Professor Keith Morey looked at her, this small, worried teenager who could probably tear apart his laboratory with her bare hands without breaking a sweat, and realized that the most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their strength or their reflexes or their dense bones. It was their complete lack of awareness about how absolutely terrifying they were. "Miss Rodriguez," he said carefully, "I believe we may need to make some adjustments to our safety protocols." Emma nodded earnestly. "Whatever you think is best, Professor. I really don't want to hurt anyone." As medical assistants arrived and carefully extracted Professor Keith Morey from the examination room, he made a mental note to revise his assessment of Deathworld species. The preliminary data had been wrong about one crucial detail. Emma Rodriguez wasn't average by human standards. She was gentle by human standards. The thought of what an aggressive human might be capable of kept him awake for weeks.